Ram Navami clashes in West Bengal's Howrah.
Muslim families have started migrating to safer places to protect themselves.
The series of communal riots that has happened or has been happening in India in the last 2-3 years have actually made us wonder why there are Muslim areas.
ये तो बताइए ना वकार साहब,
ये मुस्लिम मोहल्ला क्या होता है?
What is a Muslim area, शहजाद पूनावाला?
Or this whole concept of Muslim areas is there in a secular India. Hello, I'm Nazima Parveen. I'm currently associated with Kriya University. My book, Contested Homelands, Politics of Space and Identity, makes an attempt to understand the contemporary question of the communalization and politicization of religious identity and space. It tries to explain the long process of transformation of caste and craft-based shared community spaces into communal pockets in colonial Delhi, which includes Shahjahanabad, the capital city, and its multiple manifestations in post-colonial Delhi. How did the relationship between community and space come to be defined on religious lines? And in what ways were Muslim-dominated areas perceived as contested zones? So let's begin with the demographic profile of the pre-colonial Delhi. The principle of community construction or the community-space relationship was very different. It was primarily based upon the conventional caste hierarchies practiced commonly by all across religious communities in pre-colonial period. This demographic configuration of Shahjahanabad had three important aspects during the Mughal period. First, religion was not the defining feature of different mohallas. Instead, different professions or caste associated with numerous caste communities were the determining factors in the living pattern of the city. Secondly, class or prestige was an important factor in the traditional demographic makeup of mohallas, since it had a crucial place in the overall administrative discourse of Mughal cities in India. This caste and economic status configuration was very much reflected in the residential patterns too, as the mohallas were also demarcated predominantly on the same lines. It did not, however, mean that religious differences were insignificant for the residents of Shahjahanabad. Apart from the chaos-centered minor religious conflicts, tussles were more sectarian like Shia-Sunni or Hindu-Jain conflicts and much more localized in nature. With the establishment of formal colonial rule, the British authorities became highly concerned about the security and social conflicts that may pose a challenge to their power. Consequently, the traditional administrative mechanism was replaced by the municipal structure of local administration under the Police Act of 1861. The spatial restructuring of Delhi actually paved the way for a new segregated discourse. I present three examples or simultaneous processes to elaborate this point. The 1857 revolt is the first movement that initiated a process of the reorganization of city space on communal lines for the first time. After recapturing the city in mid-September 1857, initial indiscriminate killings and forced evacuations, the British Army resorted to a selective treatment of the rebels to prevent any possible future threats. Thus, three measures were employed to punish rebels who they identified as treacherous Muslims. Mohallas populated by Muslims were destroyed, killing the residents. Secondly, selective desecration of Muslim religious places of worship. And finally, the selective resettlement of population. The Muslim population was readmitted into the city by an order in only 1860, but their properties were confiscated and finally sold or auctioned out to favorable groups of trading classes. These measures not only disturbed the caste and craft-based demography, but also established religious identity as a defining marker of communities. The codification and legalization of cow slaughter and the regularization of meat business is the second example, which led to the demarcation of Hindu-Muslim spaces. As we know, cow sacrifice was a point of dispute between meat-eating communities and those groups who worshipped cow in pre-British period. But it actually never became a serious communal conflict between Hindus and Muslims. It was because the Mughal rulers, since the time of Babur, had prohibited cow slaughter on the day of Bakra Eid to avoid any such conflicts. The British authorities brought cow slaughter and meat business into a legal framework for fulfilling the requirement of beef among British officials and in the army cantonments and for conflict management. The authorities actually completely neglected the royal proclamations and codified the practice of slaughter by issuing orders and decrees, which actually, in effect, produced more complications. This conflict management had two important aspects. One, legalization of the practice, and two, delimitation of the community space. The Delhi municipality concretized this demarcation of space and cultural practices with more modern and rational vocabulary. It clubbed meat business, which included slaughtering, transportation, and sale, under the definition of offensive trades. The municipal bylaws issued in 1913 finally set a comprehensive legal framework for meat trade. The committee created delimited zones and demarcated public routes for animal sacrifice, transportation of meat from slaughterhouses to private homes, and public processions during all major festivals. This demarcation was done on the basis of religious identity of inhabitants of different mohallas. Accordingly, the animal slaughter was allowed only in the 3 delimited zones. Each zone had a gate of the city through which cattle could be brought, accompanied by not more than 7 people. The flesh also had to be carried back through the same gates, while being covered in cloth and not displayed in such a manner as to hurt the feeling of others. However, this marking increased the possibilities of a clash on all festive occasions. The fourth example that I am going to discuss here is political representation. The Ripon municipal reforms of 1880s introduced local self-government with direct elections through restricted franchisee and a voting right to the landed and educated classes. It demarcated residential wards as Hindu-Muslim electoral constituencies, which were simultaneously identified as majority and minority areas in official and political terms. The questions such as who represents whom become important as the multiple official reports highlighted the need to have adequate representation of all interest groups. This question eventually transformed into the famous debate on joint versus separate electorate. These developments defined 3 things: communities as communal territorial constituencies, voters as members of communities, not individuals, and the educated and propertied classes as legitimate representatives. It took ward as the basic geographical unit for delimitation. This specific colonial form of representative politics produced a contested space in high politics. As a result of these colonial policies, 3 official categories, Hindu-dominated, Muslim-dominated, and mixed or combined areas came into existence. By the 1940s, a discourse of homeland emerged. There were 3 dominant ideas of India that existed in parallel. For example, Nehru and Congress's imagination of a united India, Jinnah and Muslim League's definition of a Muslim India called Pakistan, and Savarkar-led Hindu Mahasabha's claim for a Hindu Rashtra. These ideas of homeland concretized the colonial demarcation of Hindu, Muslim, and mixed areas. Different political groups introduced the vocabulary of homeland to justify their acts and patterns of mobilization in the gullies and mohallas of Delhi. A number of volunteer groups called armies, guards, or senas were formed during this period. It shows that the disciplining and militarizing the youth actually became an important feature of local politics in Delhi in the mid-1940s. The activities in Delhi intensified with the continuous failure of negotiations in high politics. These negotiations established that only a power-sharing arrangement between the two major political parties could prevent communal disputes between Hindus and Muslims and determine whether British India would be better off united or divided. The cabinet mission in 1946 officially rejected Jinnah's claim for an independent sovereign Muslim state and suggested the formation of a constituent assembly to draft a constitution for the whole of India. Quite interestingly, the cabinet mission also re-established communal categories. The constituent assembly was to be represented by 3 sections. Section A was to combine a Hindu majority provinces. Section B was to be constituted of Muslim majority provinces, and Section C was to be formed of Bengal and Assam. The 3 official categories were eventually employed as yardsticks for the partition of British India into Muslim majority region called Pakistan and Hindu majority region called India, leaving the minority regions and mixed zones as contested forever. The partition of Indian subcontinent did not put the contradictory yet parallel ideas of the homeland to rest. Instead, it reinforced religion as the marker of identity at every level of society. Nehru's idea of India was translated into a nation-building project for a secular Republic of India in the 1950s, with an overwhelming adherence to territorial unity. This proposal for a strong and united India, however, also reshaped the imagination of Hindu Rashtra into a claim for Akhand Bharat based on Hindu ideals. The Hindu Mahasabha, RSS, and the newly established Bharatiya Janasangh appropriated the state ideology and came out with a revised version of Hindu Rashtra. That is, the Indianization of religious minorities, especially Muslims. In this context, the idea of Pakistan, along with other political economic processes, also emerged as an antagonistic and provocative force, the adversarial other, to define India in terms of cultural assimilation, territorial unity, and above all, as a secular nation. The Constituent Assembly debates reveal that the state rejected religion as an official category or a prime marker of identity, and the terminology of minority-majority was considered to be a more democratic and secular way of recognizing communities in post-colonial, post-partition context. But while the meaning of minority was overwhelmingly constitutionalized, it merely reinforced the division between Hindu majority and non-Hindu minority in the immediate aftermath of partition. Refugee camps were also divided on the basis of religious identity, that is, Hindu-Sikh refugee camps and Muslim refugee camps. The Hindu and Sikh victims of partition violence came from the divided Punjab. The Muslim refugee camps came into the picture due to internal displacement of Muslim population of Delhi and UP due to violence. Muslim communities moved from mixed areas of Old Delhi to Muslim camps and Muslim-dominated areas. These areas were defined as protected Muslim zones and Muslim refugee camps in the official vocabulary. However, these Muslim concentrations were tagged as mini Pakistans situated in India and threats to internal security. There was also the case of cow politics. The aggressive cow protection movement produced cow as a significant political symbol in competitive electoral politics in the 1960s. The trajectory of meat value chain, religious, caste and class dynamics show how municipal bylaws define meat, especially bade ka gosht or the meat of big animals, as an important marker of Muslim ilaqe and re-establish them as culturally demarcated sites. The politics over Eidgah slaughterhouse, meat shops and the locality of Qasapura reveals that the contest over meat practice categorically placed a commercial activity and food habit in a binary opposition to the selective Brahmanical, vegetarian, urban educated middle class sensitivities. The partition of India, in this sense, actually transformed religious identity of space into concrete social and political categories. It produced an intrinsically linked discourse of inclusion and exclusion. The Muslim zones and or Muslim ilaqe, which were placed bizarrely in a wider secular Indian space, emerged as a powerful urban category in this period. The subsequent communal violence transformed these pockets into communally sensitive areas. The Hindutva politics continued to refer to them as symbols of Pakistan. Simultaneously, the cow politics helped political class to consolidate both ideologies, the secular India and the Hindu nation of India, while demarking Muslim localities with visible symbols that defined marginalization as backwardness and unhygienic living patterns. The 1970s was a phase of national emergency. It was also the phase of the Operation Urbanization that focused on the reorganization of city space and communities through clearance, redevelopment, resettlement, and population control. In this schema, the Muslim concentrated pockets were seen as failures of the expected secularization program and perceived as closed and segregated pockets. At the same time, these areas also became the source of concern for national security in the backdrop of two wars with Pakistan in 1965 and in 1971. The complex configuration of local politics of the late 1960s and early 1970s transformed Muslim pockets of Old Delhi like Jama Masjid and Turkman Gate into sites of internal threat and mini Pakistan in the official vocabulary. These mini Pakistans had to be reorganized through clearance and population control. This objectification of Muslim space in this phase should be seen in relation to the broader urban policy framework. There was a forced clearance cum rehabilitation cum redevelopment drive by the DDA. The forced clearance was followed by police firing and atrocities, killing and injuring a number of local residents. Simultaneously, the family planning program was also linked to the DDA's clearance drive. The unsettled residents were forced to get sterilized to avail housing benefits as incentives. Concerns for national security after the Bangladesh war and especially during the national emergency amalgamated with the larger Indianization project and eventually led to a highly authoritarian notion of nationalism. The official narrative of the Jama Masjid and Turkman Gate clearance events reiterated the Indianization project, reducing the killing and police brutality to the unwillingness of Muslim communities towards family planning. These events were forgotten in political circles and erased from public memory with the end of the anti-emergency narrative. But the perceptions that these events reinforced about Muslim areas remained unwritten but important determining factors in the official framework. In the discourse of urban development, Muslim living spaces were regarded as contentious sites that were best to be left alone because the community was against the inclusive living and progressive ideas like population control. These pockets were thus deprived of necessary improvement that was required for development, a fact underlined by the Sachar Commission report. Therefore, the notion of communal space in Delhi is a product of a long historical process. The discourse of Homeland and the realities of partition demarcated space on religious lines and established Muslim-dominated areas as segregated, exclusionary, and contested zones. These localities turned out to be those pockets where the dominant ideas of nation had to be engineered, materialized, and practiced in different political contexts. Consequently, these localities were looked at differently over the period. In the 1940s, as Muslim areas that were to be administered for the sake of communal peace. In the 1950s, as Muslim zones that needed to be protected to be secured. In the 1960s, these localities were seen as isolated, unhygienic cultural pockets that were to be cleaned and Indianized. And finally, in the 1970s, these localities were defined as locations of internal threat, the mini Pakistans, that were to be dismantled. These dominant notions have resulted in the objectification, or more appropriately, museumization of the everyday spatial practices and culture of a living community. It is one of the reasons why these pockets came to be seen as terrorist hideouts in the altered political scenario of the 1990s, and the reason why the issues that underpin such objectification persist in the 21st century.